Well, welcome to Between the Times, a podcast ministry of Christ Church Presbyterian. And this is our official first video cast that we are doing. And, we're getting a little crazy here, feeling a little overconfident probably now that we've been doing so many things online over the last couple of months. But it's good to be here, here with our two usual co-hosts, Reverend Michael Bauer, the assistant pastor at Christ Church Presbyterian, as well as Dr. Gabriel Williams, who is a member of Christ Church Presbyterian and also a professor over at the College of Charleston. And then we have a special guest with us today, Dr. George Carter, who is doing a fellowship in pulmonary and critical care medicine and doing a 3-year fellowship here. We often at Christ Church will have physicians coming through doing fellowships for a few years, and we always try to get them to stay and to move here, but they keep shipping off. So we're hoping the Carters will be able to stick around after he gets done with his fellowship. But we're so glad, George, to have you here with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
And our goal for this episode is to, first of all, talk a little bit about the COVID-19 crisis and the way that it's affected church and church life, and to discuss, some of the things that we've been trying to do as a congregation as well, and to maybe talk a little bit about the impact of those ministries, and then move into a time where we can hear from, particularly from George as a physician working at MUSC downtown and dealing with the various protocols and challenges related to the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, with the quarantine and so many opinions that are going around online, through social media, through the news. And we just want to discuss that and hear from you, George, about some of your thoughts regarding these things. Because the fact is, everybody thinks they're an expert in everything. And you've been spending the last, I don't know how many, 10 years of your life studying medicine, and you're going to have something more intelligent to say than your typical passerby on the street who thinks they know everything about how this virus works and what we should be doing and thinking. So glad you're here with us. And so I just want to kind of open things up and, let's talk for a few minutes, brothers, about this, the church's response to the COVID-19 crisis. Maybe just not even, just our congregation, but in the wider church. What are some things that you've been seeing, and what are some impressions that you've been having? Gabe, I'll ask you to comment on it first.
Yeah, sure. When I observe what's been going on, I guess, for the last 12 weeks, 10 to 12 weeks, something to that effect, I think multiple congregations have had to just reason through their own individual response. And so not every congregation is the same. Some congregations have members that are much older and therefore would be more susceptible to the damaging effects of COVID-19. Some are younger. And so the response has been kind of across the board. But at least on what I've seen on my kind of social media feed from pastors I respect, it looks like pastors have understood that on the first hand, if you're going to take away the ordinary means of grace from the congregation in terms of not coming to Lord's Day worship, not having the sacraments, then the pastors have kind of seen it as their responsibility to make sure that the congregants are still engaged with one another, that they're still in some sense of fashion have a sense of normalcy, even though everything else around them is abnormal, basically. And so that's led to a lot of online internet sort of ministries. And so most of the churches I see some pastors doing Bible readings 2 or 3 times a week and just doing commentary on that as a way to kind of keep people engaged. We've had prayer meetings happening almost around the clock, it seems, from different ministries I've been looking at, which is great. It's great to have online Zoom prayer meetings and things like that. Other things that I've seen from other places has been that pastors are much more intentional in writing letters to their congregation. So, You see a lot more, what I've been told is a lot more emailing to the congregation in terms of making sure that the congregation understands, at least in some way, have a sense of what's going to happen in the next several weeks. No one knows for certain, but a lot more encouragements, a lot more exhortations to trust in the midst of a lot of other difficulties. And then there's just the simple reality that a lot of us who have been using social media for a long time, you now have to discipline yourself now that you're at home to make sure that you're not wasting your time in social media. That's pastors and everyone else alike, right? And so the other thing I've observed is that when pastors are online, they are much more intentional about their words they're using. They're much more intentional about their time. There seems to be a lot less online debating about tertiary topics because there's a much more important thing going on. So in that sense, that's great. But then you just have the reality that me and everyone else in our congregation, we all know what it feels like not to have Lord's Day worship in person. And it was going on for 10 to 12 weeks. So some congregations have already started coming back. Depending upon what state you live in, this may be going on through June. And so you're having a situation where hundreds of thousands of people are not receiving the Lord's Supper, and they're realizing how much they're missing it, which I think is a great, great thing to realize. You should not take advantage of the means of grace or take it for granted in that sense. So I say across the board, there's a lot of just getting adjusted to the weirdness of having to see people through a camera, basically. I know you both have mentioned to me the weirdness of preaching to pews with no one there and just looking at a camera. That's, again, you just got to get used to that weirdness now, apparently. But then there's just the real desire to think to yourself that, thank the Lord that this is not permanent, that there will be a time where we can come back together and actually enjoy Christian fellowship person to person, face to face.
Yeah. Michael, of course, you have probably now preached to empty pews more than you've preached to people in your young ministry. Is that right?
In Christ Church, yes.
Christ Church, yeah.
Yep. Yeah, I think it was this past Sunday or maybe the one before. It was that put me over the threshold where I've now preached more to a camera and empty pews than to real life people.
So you should be able to write a book now on being a televangelist. And
sure. Yeah, I wouldn't go that far, but yeah, I think this as Gabe was saying, sort of jumping off of that, this crisis has caused some churches and pastors to maybe kicking and screaming at times, but to be brought into the 21st century technologically. Right, to have to use these means to communicate with their people, it makes us sort of rethink ministry. And as Gabe is saying, I think it really makes us as pastors realize how important face-to-face ministry is. That it's vital and can never be replaced by any of these. As great as it is to have technology like Zoom to be able to see people, it doesn't even come close to being able to be face-to-face with one another. And I think for pastors in conservative churches, especially those who have never really relied on technology, they've recognized the importance of face-to-face meeting and the flaws inherent in those churches that are maybe just campus churches or that have each week, a sermon piped in from a pastor who's not even there and doesn't know his congregation. And that's just such a vital thing, I think, for pastors to be reminded of that, and to be reminded that we really need to know our people in order to preach well to them, in order to minister to them effectively. We need to know them, and this by its absence over the last 10, 12 weeks, I think that's been reinforced a lot to so many pastors.
One of the real challenging things, of course, for smaller churches that don't have large staffs and sort of people already there who are working with the various technology, websites, live streams. Like a lot of churches already had this stuff in place. And so the transition to those kinds of ministries was very smooth and in many ways without issue. Churches like ours that didn't have a live stream service, that weren't really doing a lot of things online, as it were, except for our website and Facebook page. We try to keep those up. It was quite an ordeal and took a tremendous amount of time and effort, energy to put all of these things in place. And we're still trying to improve it, of course. But we did implement a few ministries. We had the Tuesday afternoon kids story time with Pastor John. I know the Carters and the Williams kids were present at that, and it was fun to connect with them in that way. And then Tuesday evenings, the Zoom young adults Bible study. Wednesday afternoons, the midweek devotional and the Psalms that I taught. And then Wednesday evenings, the prayer meeting, which was a real blessing. That's been one of the highlights for me personally, is to see everybody's faces and to have a full screen of members and kids. It just has been a real blessing. And Thursday morning, the men's Bible study in Joshua. And then, of course, our morning and evening worship services on the Lord's Day. And so it's been quite a bit of stuff online. Let me ask, we'll ask George to pipe in here. What have been some of the impressions you've had from the church's online ministries, impressions, things you've been encouraged by, things that perhaps you hadn't thought about before as it concerned all these things?
Yeah, well, maybe I can offer the perspective from the opposite end of the church member ladder, so to speak. I think we're some of the newer members in the church and have really appreciated the opportunity to be involved so much, remotely during this time that we're not able to come together. Like you said, our family has been involved with quite a few of those activities. Obviously, Sunday morning church, Sunday evening church, Lord's Day worship, something that's been very important to us. And I think that certainly we've been right there alongside everyone else with growing pains and learning how to navigate that with small children and how do we make that work for our family. And I think the most abundant thing that we were able to learn from that was that it's absolutely vital that we have Lord's Day worship and that we join the body for corporate worship in whatever manner that we can. Even in this time where, it wasn't right or responsible for us to be able to meet together in person, we had to do something. So we absolutely thought that was great and were able to participate. I think the other thing that it showed us is how much of a pale imitation it is of true in-person corporate worship, and showed us what the importance is of gathering with the body, of enjoying the ordinary means of grace, of having the sacraments. Last week coming back and having evening worship and being able to see everyone was wonderful. And we just were so looking forward to it and so excited for it. Our kids were so excited for it, which was a real blessing to us as parents. And then I think in terms of staying connected throughout the week, I can say that, again, as just an ordinary church member, I think that I heard from every elder, probably most of the deacons in the church at some point. It was very clear that there was an intentional movement to have people reaching out, have people touching base, to check in and see how the congregation was doing, to make sure that everyone was being heard and being prayed for, and that, needs weren't going unmet because we weren't able to speak to each other face to face and have that easier method of communication. Our kids loved the afternoon Bible story times every single Tuesday. They'd wake up in the morning and say, it's Tuesday, we're going to have story time with Pastor John. Occasionally they'd watch one of the older ones before we got set up for the live stream. And I think we're still going to have to let them continue to watch those videos that have been recorded, just because that's an integral part of their week at this point. And then the Wednesday evening prayer meetings, we were able to participate in most of those, other than some evenings that I was working. And that was just such a wonderful experience to be able to both participate in praying in those, as well as just to listen along with the congregation and to have the experience of corporate prayer and of voices being lifted up and those devotions that were being taught as well, to be able to share in that in this time. We are looking forward to getting back together in person, though.
Yes. for our listeners who may not know, we had several friends join us to lead in brief devotions prior to our season of prayer, just a 15-minute or so devotion. We had guys, let's see, the week one, I think, was Joel Beakey, and then Bob Godfrey. We had Derek Thomas, Ligon Duncan, Harry Reeder, and Julius Kim this past week, and just a real encouragement to hear from these brothers, and also the time of prayer was such an encouragement, because I for one hadn't heard a lot of the folks pray before publicly, and so to have that venue where every Wednesday night we're hearing people praying was really outstanding. And talking to fellow pastors, that's been for them as well one of the real positives about this time of quarantine is the size of the prayer meeting. Our prayer meeting is like 10 times bigger than it normally is, and it makes it very convenient, of course, when you just have to click a button and you can join from your living room in the evening. So what a blessing that was. Well,
John, I just have a quick question for you. All the technology and different things that you've talked about that we've used during this time, are any of those, now that we're slowly transitioning at Christ Church because of the South Carolina laws, we're able to slowly transition back into meeting together. Any of those technological tools that we used during the quarantine, are we going to continue using some of those? Or is it maybe another way of asking that is the quarantine going to change in some ways our practices as a church in some positive ways?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I think that's something we need to discuss. Certainly, I have found myself in the last week and a half engaged in so much pastoral visitation throughout the day, and other duties and responsibilities that because now the quarantine's being lifted, suddenly I've got this new load of work on my desk that. Suddenly I don't have, 2 hours to get ready for the midweek devotional on Wednesday afternoons. So yeah, I think that there's something to the possibility of us continuing a prayer meeting, maybe having some kind of a monthly online thing that encourages our folks, also gives the church greater exposure. But that's something certainly I'd want to talk about with the elders to get some feedback on.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, we've talked about live streaming and how that's an important aspect of our ministry and outreach right now.
Yes, as it concerns shut-ins, people who are ill, people who are not quite ready to come back. I mean, this threat may be here for a while, and then in terms of an outreach standpoint, I know of many who are unchurched, who are regularly watching our services and letting us know that they were tuning in. And so it's very encouraging that way. And so I hope and pray that the Lord will have used this and continue to use it into the future. Yeah, it's very helpful. Now, George, you had mentioned earlier that, part of our going to all of these ministries is to express appropriate levels of caution. And we have sought to do that. We have had over 10 weeks of online services. We have sought to be extremely careful with that. And however, our government officials are lifting some of the restrictions. And we are trying to responsibly begin to meet again, because we believe that church is essential. It's we're learning all these new phrases, right? Self-distancing, essential business. We believe that the church is essential, and so we have decided as a session to begin gathering together again responsibly. And yet, of course, there will be those that will say it's not time, we're not ready. I was really interested to hear some of your feedback this week when we met for coffee about kind of the levels of patience at MUSC, what we've been experiencing here locally and even regionally compared to places like Lombardy, Italy, and New York, and where there have been some pretty serious outbreaks. That, it would seem, should make a difference as to how we respond to this, considering our proximity. And I just kind of wanted to ask you to share a few of your thoughts about some of those matters, because there's a lot of strong words being thrown around. People are angry and feeling like there's a lot of irresponsibility. Meanwhile, we have 40 million people out of work in America, and suicide rates up 1,800%, and very real issues like that are just as real as the coronavirus, right? And so I would love just to, as a physician, to get some of your expert opinions and analysis on some of these things going on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you're talking about something like this and issues that are this potentially controversial, it's always important to remember that just like Gabe mentioned, there are as many outlooks on teleworship as there are churches. When you're talking about something like this pandemic, there's about as many opinions out there as there are people, and there's certainly as many opinions as there are doctors. I am by no means a COVID-19 expert, but I am in training in a field that is very closely linked to the disease and have taken care of patients that have COVID-19. And being at MUSC, I have not been part of any administrative decision-making processes, but I've certainly been in contact with a lot of people who have heard a lot of things from people who are, and it's something that they've been disseminating all of that information. So obviously anything that I express is my opinion, doesn't represent anything higher from the institution, but I can speak to some of what we've been seeing and what we've been hearing, both here locally and from a lot of our contacts across the country, particularly in those places you mentioned that have been more affected. So what I would say is that here locally, we have been very, very fortunate to have not been affected as badly as we had initially feared might be the case. Really, even from the very beginning, when we were looking at all these things in February and March, the message that we were receiving internally was that there was a very real chance that we would have a significant surge of COVID-19 patients that could potentially put a strain on our system and on our resources. I will say that, again, speaking just from my own experience with MUSC, our administration was very prompt in responding to that, making preparations and plans for that. And I felt very well supported, which was great for us as one of the larger institutions and healthcare organizations here locally. It made me feel good just for our community, that that's the sort of thing that was happening. I'll tell you that the actual patients that we've been seeing and the volumes that we've been seeing at the hospital have been nowhere near what the worst case projections were. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. I think number one is that we have to understand that just like churches have different demographics, communities have different demographics, hospitals have different demographics, and the risk profile of a place like Charleston is different than a place like New York. We don't necessarily understand everything that goes into that or have a great grasp of exactly why it is that we haven't been quite as affected. There's a lot of theories, like population density and things like that, but for whatever reason, for all of those factors, it just did not hit us as hard. I think the other thing that we have to look at is we certainly were not the entry point into the United States for this. So we had the benefit of seeing what was happening in Seattle, of seeing what was happening in New York before we started to get to the point where our cases were picking up. And we were able to implement things like social distancing, like closing of non-essential businesses relatively early. I got an epidemiology report from our institution yesterday that laid out looking at new cases of COVID-19, deaths from COVID-19, both on a daily basis and on a total aggregate basis throughout the entirety of this pandemic, really dating back to the very beginning of March. And they're specifically pointing out all of the different times along the way when we started implementing precautions, when we started recommending people stay home, when laws were passed that were essentially a stay-at-home order, and being able to track out how that was affecting the case incidents a week, 2 weeks after the fact. And what I can tell you is that really since the middle of March, when we implemented all of these precautions, we have seen, a rising number of cases, and we've seen continually a slow increase in the number of total cases and a slow increase in the total number of deaths, both statewide as well as here in Charleston County. But what we're seeing is that that is not accelerating and that we never hit that exponential growth. is what we were fearing. That's what they saw in Italy. That's what they saw in New York. And so many of my colleagues who work in those places, particularly in New York, I've heard from a lot of people up the East Coast who got absolutely overwhelmed, and they didn't have the capacity in their hospitals with resources, with staff, with equipment to be able to manage that. And it put a huge strain on their system. And I think we've all seen that on the news. I know people that I work with, nurses, respiratory therapists, who actually left here to go work in those places to help relieve some of that strain. Resources were being shunted in that direction, and appropriately so, because of what they were experiencing. But because we were able to implement at a point that was earlier in the time course of the pandemic relative to the cases we were seeing, I think that was a huge factor in why we didn't see a worst case scenario here. I think the caution that we have to have is that a lot of people will quickly jump to, well, things weren't as bad as we thought they might be initially. That means the projections were wrong. That means that it was a waste of time for us to close our businesses and tank our economy and keep our people indoors and not go to church and everything else that we're talking about. And I think that's a very dangerous place to go to. I think we have to acknowledge that we don't know exactly how much of our, let's say, good fortune as a community in not experiencing a worse surge of patients. I don't know how much of that was the different demographics of Charleston, and I don't know how much of it was the fact that we got on top of things early. I imagine it was a significant contribution of both, and I think people should feel positively when they're looking back at the measures that we took and the precautions that were implemented, because I do think they were effective. I think when we start talking about reopening, when we start talking about how do we move forward from this, and what is this going to look like over the next month, over the next 6 months, over the next year, however long it is that we're dealing with this, because this is going to be an issue that is talked about and could potentially change, could get worse, could come back. We don't know what the future holds, but we do know that it's going to be something that we're dealing with for quite some time. Mm-hmm. I think it's important before we start talking about those things to really clarify a few distinctions when we talk about what we feel like the risks are and what we feel like the impact has been. Because there are a lot of people out there that have very loud voices, that want to be heard, that have a very particular perspective that they want to discuss. And two people who seem to be disagreeing may not be mutually exclusive or mutually wrong, because they may be coming at it from completely different angles that they're discussing. So when I talk about what my fears are with this pandemic and what I feel like the risks are with this pandemic and the impact of this pandemic, there are a couple of different aspects of it that I think we have to talk about. The first one, which I think is the most commonly discussed, is what is this impact on our society as a whole? When we look at 350 million people in the United States, 6 billion people in the world, how is that affecting the human population as a whole, both from the standpoint of the disease affecting them, of people getting sick, of people dying, of people having slow recovery from the disease, being in the hospital? How is that affecting everyone? I think you have to look at how is it affecting our hospital systems in particular. We know that this disease, more so than a lot of other diseases, even probably more so than the flu, which is something we've got a lot more experience with, it leads to very prolonged illnesses. When people get sick with this and they're sick enough to be in the hospital, they're in the hospital for a really long time. And we're seeing that. Again, all of these reports that we're having access to, looking at aggregations of cases, both locally and across the country, as well as just my own personal experience in the hospital, is that people get this disease and they're sick in the hospital for a long time, regardless of whether they ultimately die or they recover. And that puts a huge burden on our hospitals. So I think those are the first two. And then the last thing that we always have to talk about is what is any one particular person's individual risk. And I think that is one that can be probably the most controversial and that can be the most misunderstood when people are talking about this. It induces a lot of emotions. And I think it's an easy flashpoint for people to really get fired up about it. And I think a lot of the animosity that you're seeing has to really do with how individual risk is interfacing with those other things that we talked about. So I think to address each one of those, I would say that in terms of risk to our society and risk to the population of people as a whole, this pandemic has been very significant and very severe. We've gotten over 100,000 deaths in the United States. We've gotten close to 400,000 deaths worldwide as of the latest numbers. That is a massive toll by the scale of a modern pandemic. It's significantly more than your average flu season. And you're talking about probably 4 to 5, if not more, standard flu seasons worth of illness and death that's happened over the course of 2 to 3 months, whereas a normal flu season is 6 to 8 months. So you're packing years and years worth of illness into just a few months. So I think it's very real, the way that it's affected really society as a whole. I think the other thing to say is that if you look back historically, this is not that far off of what we saw with the first wave of the Spanish flu in 1918 in terms of the number of deaths. Obviously, the Spanish flu was much worse as a second and third wave than it was as a first, but this is roughly comparable to the first wave of that. And I think that's the reason that you have a lot of the projections that you do and a lot of the fears that you do, because people are worried that we might have something along those lines.
Now, George, was
yes.
the Spanish flu similar to COVID in terms of its effects upon the elderly and those with pre-existing conditions or comorbidities? Was that more attacking people from all age ranges? I'm asking because I don't really know. I was assuming so.
So it was, looking back, there's a lot of debate about the Spanish flu and its impacts and what exactly it entailed. And, there are people who have made careers off of researching that. And again, not an expert on that particularly, but it's something that we've discussed quite a bit in relation to the current pandemic. Generally similar in the terms of just, it was a severe respiratory illness that caused a very similar pattern of disease. What I'll tell you is that I think there are some key differences. And some of these we're not going to fully understand because of the just the lack of knowledge that we have around the Spanish flu and some of the extenuating circumstances at that time. Because remember, the Spanish flu happened in the middle of World War I. So anything happening in the world at that time has to be viewed through the lens of the greatest global crisis in modern history up to that time, at least. And one could argue of that time or of our time happening simultaneously with that illness. So it's really difficult to tease out some of those details. But what we do know is the Spanish flu affected people from all ages. It was similar to kind of our modern flu pandemics in that it did disproportionately impact the elderly, those who had advanced pre-existing conditions, particularly as ages got older. A few key differences of what we're seeing from the current pandemic and the historical data we have with the Spanish flu is that the Spanish flu affected children, which is much more similar to the flu that we see these days. It does affect children severely, whereas thankfully COVID-19 has had a relatively mild effect in children. There is not as much critical illness. There is not nearly as much mortality. And again, speaking as the parent of small children and someone who works in a hospital and has risk for exposure, that is very reassuring to me on an individual basis for my family and again, for our culture. So I think children being spared is something that would be different. The Spanish flu also did have a peak in essentially otherwise relatively healthy young adults. A lot of theories for that. Again, this was happening during World War I when you had a lot of people living in conditions that were suboptimal, to say the best, when you're looking at particularly men in their 20s. They weren't necessarily living the same lifestyle in 1918 that we are today, certainly, or even that they would have been 5 years before that, not in the middle of a world war. When we go back and look, we know that the Spanish flu caused an illness that's similar to what we're seeing now. This is nothing new under the sun in terms of the processes that are going on or what we're seeing. There's obviously subtle distinctions, and there's effects that are currently being researched, and pretty much everybody in the world in the medical community is trying to wrap their heads around this right now. It is the sole focus of most of what we're doing. But what I'll tell you is that it causes very similar illness to what we've been seeing for a long time. We know how to take care of patients that are affected by this, and we have things that we can do for them. We don't right now have a wonder drug or a miracle cure, and I certainly hope that somebody finds one. I don't know if they will or not, but in the meantime, we certainly know what the best treatments that we have available are to support people with these illnesses. Those treatments were not available in 1918 because obviously the world has advanced quite a bit in 100 years, and certainly the fields of medicine that I'm training in currently didn't even exist back then. So
we live certainly in a brave new world as it concerns digital technology, with the 24-hour news cycle, with social media. Everybody has a voice. Everybody believes that their voice is just as authoritative and valuable as others' voices, even though they may be they may have cobbled together a kind of medical education through the internet, because they've read 100 articles on something. They think they have as much authority to speak on a subject than someone who's been to medical school.
My signature and WebMD both end in MD, so
yeah, exactly.
Basically similar.
WebMD education.
Yeah, so it's a strange time, and one thing I wanted to bring up before we end this time together is the role of the church in this. And I mentioned a few things before the service on Sunday night. It's been interesting, sociologically and also just ecclesiastically to watch people, to watch Christians, to watch the church, and to hear the kinds of things that are being said and to watch the kinds of things that are being done. And I had to sympathize with an author from the UK who had written, I don't know if it was an op-ed or just an article in a UK publication, and basically he was asking, where's the church? It seems as though in the old days, and that's kind of the way he put it, in previous generations, when a pandemic broke out or there was some major catastrophe, the church was speaking courageously and boldly into the lives of their people and into the lives of the general population. So what you're seeing here in our world, which is a very therapeutically driven world, right? We're in the Instagram world, particularly in the middle and upper classes, where everybody's afraid to die. Nobody wants to talk about things that are a downer, right? Even when you see all of the various videos being made and things going on online, there's a lot of humor inserted, and I'm not against that. I think a lot of things that have been done over the last 2 months have been pretty funny. But it's like people are trying to alleviate their fears through Netflix binging and making little videos, and it's like people are so afraid of suffering and death and dying that they're trying to kind of alleviate that with various worldly things, and the church, which in my opinion has in general, the evangelical church has been a very therapeutically driven church as well. Pastors telling their nice little stories and not really digging into the text and being afraid to kind of preach the realities of sin, death, and hell, and God's judgment and so forth. It's interesting that you have the church, which has this really wonderful opportunity as people are have this on their mind, to speak into it, and oftentimes we fail to do that. And so what I wanted to ask in terms of for a discussion is, how can the church best speak into this right now? As you think about your families, you think about your community, what should the church be saying right now as we have this pandemic that is wrecking lives, taking lives? As you know, it took the life of my dear father-in-law. It's one of our other friends' stepfathers died from it a couple of months ago. It's very real, and it's impacting lives. Like, what's the role of the church in the midst of this?
Yeah, we talked about that a bit the other day when we got together, and I think it's difficult because of the perspectives that people are having from the outside. But from within the church, I think it's important that we remember initially why we did what we did. COVID-19 is not the apocalypse. COVID-19 is not going to end our society. It's not going to depopulate the earth. And that is not what anybody ever thought it was going to do. We made a drastic move. We closed the doors of our churches. That happened across the world, that churches closed their doors. And that's something that's not really precedented in history. The reason we did that wasn't because, and close the churches and close the rest of our society, it wasn't because we thought it was the apocalypse. We did it so that we could give our medical community time to get up to speed and be prepared and be ready to take care of people who have this disease to prevent it from getting worse. And then once we've reached that point, which I would argue in many places, not necessarily everywhere, but certainly I think here locally, once we've gotten to a point where things are sustainable, that we then shift away from talking about what is the threat to our society or what is the threat to our medical community, and start talking about what do the lives of the individual members of our church and our local community look like. And I think that's something that churches have to answer for themselves, that communities have to answer for themselves. I don't think the answer for our church and our city and our state is necessarily particularly similar to a church that is in Manhattan, in a place that is still severely affected by this and it still has a system that's strained. But I think when you're looking at a place like this, where again, looking at our hospitals and our system, we have achieved the mission statement of what we were doing with the isolation. We have controlled things to the point that the hospitals can manage for the moment. I think we have to look at, like you said, what is the role of the church? And the role of the church is to go forth and to speak the truth into dark times. And it is certainly a dark time. And times are dark for more reasons than just COVID-19. Times are dark, like you said, because people are out of work, because people are stuck in their homes, because people don't have a social outlet, because there is loneliness and isolation. And as we start to reopen the rest of our society and the rest of our businesses and to get things back on track, I think the church has to be leading the charge to get out there and to speak into that.
That's really helpful. And isn't it the church's job, and I'll ask Gabe to comment on this, isn't it the church's job to remind the flock of more than just some therapeutic driven remark that everything's going to be okay? Isn't it the church's responsibility to speak hard truth into the lives of their people, that now is the time, if ever, to trust the Lord with our lives, with our families? And you know, it is appointed every man wants to die and then comes a judgment. And we all know that death is coming, and it may come through COVID-19, right? So how does the church faithfully speak into that reality that we're experiencing right now?
I think echoing what George has mentioned, there's nothing more comforting to know that your elders, your pastors know you individually. And that means they know your particular concerns, they know your anxieties, and therefore they also know how to best respond to the situations as that you're going through. They know you. And one of the unfortunate realities that happened before COVID-19 about churches and society is that there's always been this push to make people more anonymous. There are people who are essentially trying to run away from any sort of personal responsibility, or even when it comes to a sense of the church, there's always the temptation to essentially say to yourself, I can get everything I think I need from the internet, from some other source. I don't really need to be fully engaged in the church. And when the church has been saying this message for years, that the internet doesn't replace the church, your internet preacher is not your pastor, internet Bible study is not the means of grace, et cetera, that was falling on deaf ears probably last year. We're now seeing people come to the realization that, okay, this is true. We understand that something like a global pandemic brings people to a sense of soberness. You now rank your priorities differently. And what the church should do is what it always does. The church, again, you respond to things as they come. But when you think about what the demands of the gospel are, when you think about the promises of the gospel, the responsibilities of the church, they have always been the same. We are, as a church, called to preach the gospel. We are called as a church to love our neighbors more than ourselves. We are called to, as much as we can, strengthen those in our own flock who are suffering, who are in anxiety. We are called to, if we have the ability to do so, financially support those who have lost their jobs. We're called to do all those things. And the reality is that we are still doing all those things. That hasn't changed. All that has changed is that the spotlight is now on our entire society, which is much more broken than we initially thought. A pandemic seems to bring that to light in very clear and tangible ways. So the report that you read, in which there are some places in the country where the number of deaths by suicide have exceeded COVID-19, that mentality was always there. It takes the pandemic to bring such despair and hopelessness to light. But the church's responsibility has always been the same. And that's why the message of the church cannot change. It must be the same as it was pre-COVID as post. Pre-COVID, we were always saying the same things, is that no man knows when their day of when they will meet the Lord. Everyone is fallen in sin. They are fallen in their sinfulness, and that they are responsible to God, and everyone will see God. And that has always been our message. But the promise of the gospel has always been that to those who come to the Lord Jesus Christ in faith, there is full pardon, full remission of sins. And more than that, there's also the confidence to know that the God who formed you and created you is the same God who preserves you, who protects you. I think one of the great messages I think I've been hearing from numerous pastors, including this church, it's just the realization that God has always been your provider. You weren't aware of that as much of it before than you are now. When you had a job and everything was being taken care of, that mentality may have kind of seeped into the back of your mind. Now that there are people who are unemployed, now that there are people who are dipping deep into their savings, now that there are individuals who have probably lost their businesses, you now realize that God was always your provider. He was always your sustainer. He was always your rock. And that's the same message the church preaches, that this is who our God is. And by God's providence, we now have an opportunity to hammer home what we've always believed and what we've always taught. And I think that is what, in one very clear, tangible way to say to the world, is that, there's change, there's decay, there's death everywhere we see around us, but there's still Jesus Christ, who has never changed. Our loving God has never faltered, and the promises of the gospel are still there for all who come to him in faith. That has never changed, and COVID-19 can't change that, or any future pandemic or second or third wave, possibly, of this pandemic as well.
Yeah. Can you imagine if the news cycles for the next week, all they talked about was the problem of our sin? Can you imagine if every newscaster was talking about sin and how sin separates us from our Maker, and we are all headed to the judgment, and that we need a solution to this. We need we need redemption, and so where's that going to come from? And of course, people think right now, because of the constant news and all the conversation, that COVID-19 is the greatest problem in the world, and it is not. COVID-19 is not the biggest problem in the world. The biggest problem in the world is that we are alienated from God apart from Jesus Christ. And the greatest news in the world, and the solution to our greatest problem, is that God sent his son into the world to come into this disease-infested, sin-infested, broken world, and actually bore our sin on the cross, on Calvary. And not only bore our sin, but actually received in his person the very wrath of God in our stead, all for us. And then on the third day, demonstrating that he truly was and is the eternal Son of God, he rose from the dead, proving that everything that he said and did was true. And so that's the good news that we preach into the world, whether there's a COVID-19 crisis or not. But what a great opportunity there is right now to remind our members and to proclaim to the world that the biggest problem for humanity is not this disease that everybody's been talking about 24 hours a day for the last 3 months. And that's what's been overwhelming people, is this fear of COVID-19, when they should have a fear of God. And so pastors need to be preaching this. Michael and I need to be faithfully preaching this. And we pray that people will listen and respond. And so this is quite an extraordinary time. We so appreciate Dr. George Carter joining us today for this first ever Between the Times video cast. George, you've made history. Thanks for joining us today.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
And it's Henry's birthday today. Is that right?
It is. It is.
Well, we
Big
hope
celebrations.
we hope you have a wonderful birthday celebration with the family today. And it's great to be together. And may the Lord bless the work of his church here in Charleston and around the country and the world. And may the glory of Christ be trumpeted from our pulpits. And truly, may our greatest concern not be COVID-19, but the glory of God in Jesus Christ. May that be on our minds and in our hearts, and may we encourage our neighbors to believe the same. Well, that wraps up this video cast of Between the Times. Thanks for joining us.